And meanwhile, the president's being impeached. And it is clear from the Democratic majority in the House, whenever you can get them to talk about their overall strategy for the Trump impeachment, it's clear that they are trying to, keep it short, keep it simple, get it done fairly quickly. But it's funny, the more witnesses come forward and the more we learn about the scheme for which the president is being impeached, it seems like there's more for the administration to worry about every day. And the more people associated with this administration are learning they may need to worry about whether they themselves are going to be on the hook here. Take, for example, recently mysteriously resigned U.S. Energy Secretary Rick Perry. About a week ago, the Associated Press had what I think was an underappreciated bombshell, underappreciated big scoop about Trump Energy Secretary Rick Perry. And what the Associated Press disclosed about Rick Perry was sort of somewhere on the Venn diagram between sad and embarrassing and enraging in terms of America's international reputation, in terms of what we're going to have to live down for the rest of our lives about how this administration has behaved on the world stage when they had the reins of power. I mean, it's going to take a long time to undo the way they have behaved in terms of the way we're viewed around the world. When the people of Ukraine elected themselves a young, new, outsider, reformist president earlier this year, and the inauguration for that new young president was scheduled for May, we now know, thanks to the White House releasing notes from the first congratulatory phone call from President Trump to that new president, we now know that that new president in Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, explicitly and somewhat insistently told President Trump that he really wanted President Trump himself to come to that inauguration, to show American support for Ukraine, to show that the American government would stand shoulder to shoulder with the new government in Ukraine, to bolster the standing of that new president, to make clear that Ukraine still had a rock-solid relationship with us, with their most important ally and their most important military benefactor in their war against Russia. Despite those insistent and repeated requests from Zelensky that Trump himself should come to the inauguration, Trump said no to that. Trump administration decided not to do that. They originally scheduled Vice President Mike Pence to go to the inauguration instead. We now understand from testimony to the impeachment inquiry that somewhat inexplicably, sometime between late April and mid-May, even though Vice President Pence had been scheduled to go to the inauguration and he was making plans to go and it all seemed like everything was on track for that, for some reason, without explanation, President Trump changed his mind and cut that off and told Vice President Pence that no, he would not be allowed to go to that inauguration. We still don't understand why. I mean, ultimately, the best that the U.S. government could do to show its support for the new Ukrainian government, this new Ukrainian president, was to send a lower-level delegation headed up not by the president and not by the vice president, but instead by this guy, Rick Perry. And what the AP reported a week ago about how Rick Perry comported himself on that trip and that inauguration, it is just one for the ages. Quote, two political supporters of U.S. Energy Secretary Rick Perry secured a potentially lucrative oil and gas exploration deal from the Ukrainian government soon after Rick Perry proposed one of the men as an advisor to the country's new president. Ukraine awarded the contract to Perry's supporters a little more than a month after Perry attended Zelensky's inauguration. In a meeting at the sidelines of that inauguration, Perry handed the new president of Ukraine a list of people he was recommending as energy advisors. One of the names was a longtime political backer of Rick Perry's from Texas. A week later, that Perry donor submitted a bid to drill for oil and gas on property controlled by the Ukrainian government. Despite offering millions of dollars less to the Ukrainian government compared with their only competitor for those drilling rights, the entity created by Rick Perry's Texas donor, quote, was awarded the 50-year contract by the Ukrainian government. Yeah. We were so concerned about corruption in Ukraine. We really wanted to crack down on them about their corruption. I mean, this is at a time when the U.S. is holding up and threatening hundreds of millions of dollars of U.S. aid, including military aid, to Ukraine. It's at a time when the Trump administration is demanding that the Ukrainian government needs to announce bogus investigations into Trump's political rivals? And then Rick Perry shows up and is like, yeah, the president and the vice president both decided they didn't want to come, but I'm here and I'm in charge. And hey, can you give my guys a deal? I got these guys who've given me a bunch of money for my political campaigns back home in Texas, and they want to do some drilling here. Know what I mean? Here's their names. Their bid will be in a week. That was first reported a week ago by the Associated Press. Mysteriously, Rick Perry has resigned as the impeachment scandal has broken wide open. Wants to spend more time with his, I don't know, lawyers? Anyway, now I have to tell you, big advance. In this story, in the midst of all of these impeachment hearings that are about to happen this week and everything we are learning there, now that part of the scandal has just been borne out by testimony from a new witness who was one of these guys who we had never heard of at the outset of the impeachment investigation. But this is just exactly what I'm talking about in terms of how the impeachment investigation is about something specific and about something narrowly focused. But the more we learn the story of how these Trump administration folks behaved and how the president behaved, the more scandal and the more potentially criminal behavior is being spun out from that central story. And that is next. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.